You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Chrissy Mancini Nichols.
Yay, Chrissy's here.
Yay!
So glad to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad to have you back. What have you been up to? Stuff.
A lot of planning and policy work, of course.
Of course.
Traveling, and then I do have my nifty book I've been trying to read in between. I was just trying to read a few pages.
Oh, that's right. Are you in the book? I haven't, because I saw you.
Oh, the book is Paved Paradise.
Paved Paradise by Henry Gabar. You know what? I saw you talking to Henry because you were coming to do a Monday show. And you guys were walking past, and I invited Henry in. And he was like, "No, thanks. I got other places to go." But I guess he was doing research for the book at the time.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that when I went to pick it up. I was thinking, wow, I probably talked to Henry. That had to be like 4 or 5 years ago.
Because
I remember
seeing
you.
House. Yeah, you were coming to the house.
We were sitting on 24th, I think, and yeah, and I was like, wow, look at how much has changed since then. But nothing. Parking's
the same.
Although a lot has changed, but
that's true. But still,
also nothing has changed.
That's true. People still complain about parking.
I know.
It's still something that a lot of people don't understand.
I know. The book, though, it's so well written. Like,
he's a good writer.
Yeah, it's really well written, and I'm helping Professor Shoup with one of his classes in 2 weeks. So I'm like, and he's like, "Have you read Henry's book yet?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm reading it, trying to get through it all."
How big is it? Is it a long book?
It's a normal size. It's really easy to read because there's so many stories. But I just like tonight I have some time. I want to read it.
Want to read it? Sit down and read it. Get a good glass of wine and take a look.
I'll need it. But I think the first part I underlined, even in the first few pages, he says something that was like, whoa, I need to say this in council. It's like, because we always say no one is going to a place for a parking spot. You know, if you want to go to a place, then it's like without a place to park, you can never get out of your car. And that's why people are so frustrated because they're stuck in their cars and just,
claustrophobia.
And we just expect parking to be perfect, and we don't expect that of anything else.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. From the podcast standpoint, I think Gersh at Streets Blog is going to talk to Henry. So if folks are listening, they probably get that on the break, I guess, or whenever he ends up talking to Henry about the book. So I'm excited to listen to what they come up with.
He's been all over.
Somebody said the other day, I can't remember who it was. I was talking to somebody and they're like, "Oh man, he has the best publicist ever." And I imagine it's him, probably.
It's probably him
reaching out to all his friends and stuff, but he's everywhere. I've seen it. Like at some point I had to stop posting articles about it because I was like, this is like the 15th article about
You're his book. Personal publicist.
Exactly. Oh, well, so that's exciting. And any interesting projects that you're working on? Anything like exciting that folks would love to hear about?
Well, I just started a project studying the new transit on the State Route 99 corridor in the Central Valley. You know, State Route 99 is one of the most productive corridors in terms of agriculture because so many trucks are, basically getting all of our food to market on State Route 99.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you've ever driven on. I drive on State Route 99 a lot. I try to always take Amtrak, but sometimes I'm stuck driving and it's like I'm afraid I'm gonna die every time I get.
Or you're gonna get splat with a tomato on your windshield, right?
Yeah, like a watermelon's just gonna fall on me. So we're studying the Golden State Corridor, the Golden State Boulevard right next to State Route 99 has the right of way already for some kind of BRT or, faster bus service. So studying creating that bus service and on that corridor. And then, working on a lot of curb management plans, microgrids, all that. I want to talk about later on in our show the recent project I just worked on with the City of Seattle to develop their e-cargo bike delivery system. So I'm excited about that one.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we talk about Amazon warehouses and Red Hook. Well, thanks to everyone who ordered our bus and bike scarves. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to order one, go to theoverheadwire.com. And if you want more than 5, we'll give you a 10% discount. Email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. It's not cold out anymore, but if you are in a warm weather place, we do have these scarves that are lighter weight for the bike-only scarves. So go check those out if you get a chance, theoverheadwire.com. Also, don't forget to order any of the books where we've covered with the author on the show. So bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And also our Cars Are Cholesterol stickers and t-shirts and whatever else at tpublic.bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. This is episode 132. We're in session, and I'm so glad to have Chrissy back. And also, if you are listening through your podcatcher of choice, we really appreciate that too. iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. You can find the show. Well, let's get to the news. None of that other stuff. Let's get to the news because there's so much.
A lot of swag, though.
I know. It's for over the years, I feel like I've added on and added on. These are some of the news items that were popular in the Overhead Wire Daily. I must say, before we get started, this list of articles was probably maybe the most, not eclectic collection of articles and information, but it was pretty close.
I was, some of them I was like, okay, what are we I usually copy and paste all the articles into one document, and I think it was 78 pages long.
Whoa. There's some long stuff in here, yeah. But there's a lot of good stuff in here. So let's start with college graduates, shall we? Coastal cities are now pricing out college graduates too. For a long time, coastal metros have been losing workers without a college degree to other regions as higher educated workers moved in. But now data is showing that even college educated workers are leaving high cost areas, which seems to be confusing economists who believe high pay for some still makes these areas attractive. And this was in the New York Times by Emily Badger, Robert Gebeloff, and Josh Katz. So, Chrissy, I know it's anecdata, but have you noticed any college graduates moving away from San Francisco lately?
Well, I do have across from me is a house that is all rental, and I do notice there are people constantly moving in and out, but I don't know. I don't know if it's the pandemic or because if you look at the data, so when I lived in Chicago, we were all losing population. It was like a huge issue. And I studied population. It wasn't college graduates. It was families that were leaving. In fact, college graduates were moving to Chicago. But looking at the data, it doesn't really surprise me because places like Nashville and Charlotte, they've been working to become cooler, in quotes, to attract college grads. So that's not very surprising. But I was also looking at this study from Brookings that looked at 21-22 data that show that the shift from, San Francisco and decline in San Francisco and New York and DC numbers actually was getting better last year. So is it just a pandemic thing? I'm not sure. What I was surprised by the data, though, is New York has been losing college graduates for a decade. San Francisco, San Jose, DC, those cities just started losing. I mean, for the first year that they were literally losing college grads was the year 2021, the pandemic year. Yeah. So I'm not sure how much the pandemic plays here. And, Brookings said that between 2020 and 2022, there were like pretty big turnarounds and net domestic migrants, came back to Manhattan and San Francisco. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. From a data standpoint, it says the Upshot examined an anonymized sample of millions of census records and identified people who moved, grouped them by education level and age, and then linked each mover's origin and destination with larger counties and metro areas. So that's like the basic background data stuff. But, the thing that gets me is like all these studies are telling me a lot of different things. And I am wondering if it's like the pandemic, but also just this weird churn that's going on right now. And one of the things that struck me is that for as long as I can remember, since I moved here in 2005, 2006, is that friends had moved here after graduating or getting a job or something, and then they left for some reason or another, and the churn just continued and continued. And I feel like there's some sort of like, how they talk about how there's at some point they think that the North Atlantic gyre is going to stop because of climate change and all that stuff. I was continuously thinking about that when I was thinking about this article, whereas like the pandemic was this weird like stop in the gyre, and all these people stopped, kind of in the inflow. The people kept moving out, but the inflow stopped coming. And I feel like that's part of it too, is like people have all these other options that they can go to now that because of either all these New York Times articles about Nashville or Austin or wherever else, people start to, see in popular culture all these things and places that have, grown in stature over the many years, like you mentioned. But San Francisco and New York and other cities that are high cost cities have been starting to get kind of a bad rap in the national media. Whether that's deserved or not is another question for another time. But it kind of stops people maybe from thinking about moving here for the Golden Gate Bridge or for the things that people come here for. And I feel like there's a stop in the gyre where people have moving out still, and they've always moved out because when they got here, they moved out at some point because they didn't want to stay. Either they didn't really ever want to be in San Francisco and they moved here for a job and they figured it out and they're like, oh, we're leaving and going to New York. You have all these millions of stories in media, local media especially, or Medium posts or whatever, being like, San Francisco's horrible, I'm leaving. It's like, you never really wanted to be here in the first place. So why are you telling us that much information about you leaving? So I feel like that's kind of something that's irking me a little bit, is like this narrative, but also just something's weird with the data for me for some reason. I don't know what it is, but I think it has to do with the pandemic, and I think it has to do with maybe not as much inflow as there was before. There's always been outflow, but maybe like the inflow has stopped coming.
The inflow of college graduate.
Yeah.
Because as I think about, I moved to San Francisco 6 years ago from Manhattan, previously from Chicago, from DC. Like, I think people move around. And since I moved to San Francisco, I had this huge network of friends that were already here, including some of my very best friends from other cities.
Exactly.
That moved here for jobs, but then they all had kids, and they have moved like to either outside, like San Luis Obispo, like really outside of the Bay Area, or they've moved just to be back near their family, which, might be Ohio. So, I mean, I agree. I think there is this like media thing, and this is not to say that San Francisco does not have challenges, or New York. I mean, Jeff and I were talking about some of those before the show, but there is something with the pandemic and people working wherever they want to. We'll see how that changes, because offices are coming, requiring people to be back in the office. But yeah, I mean, I walk down Chestnut Street in the Marina, and it's like all college kids just spilling out of bars and restaurants, like it was when I started coming to San Francisco when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And the narrative's funny too, because if you do go to the neighborhoods and neighborhood commercial streets, they're all packed, right? Yeah. Like 24th Street here in Noe is like as packed as it was before the pandemic, and there's people shopping and going and hanging out in places and stuff like that. So I think also, there's another article that said, why are housing costs continuing? And pricing is another, whole other level of discussion that we could have about this, about housing costs and things like that. But housing costs haven't really reduced that much. And there was an article saying that, maybe people have gotten rid of their roommates, and so they could have extra space to have a home office and stuff. But then I question that, because I'm thinking, well, who has money to pay $4,000 to $5,000 for a 2-bedroom place, and to get rid of their roommate in a place like this? So it doesn't make that doesn't make as much sense to me either. So I mean, I'm sure that there are people that have left their parents' house, or they left a roommate or whatever else. But in a city like San Francisco, I feel like that's a lot of money to spend on your rent. If you could have a roommate before and it kept you from paying a ton of money, you'd probably want to keep that roommate and not pay as much money for rent. Yeah,
I think it's funny you said how people are, there's just so much going on in the neighborhoods. Like, I was walking last Thursday, my husband and I were walking from dinner home, and I was just like, gosh, like, people are talking about downtown San Francisco and I still go downtown a lot, and I see people around. It's definitely like you can go to Sweet Green, I guess, and not wait in line as long. But, you just look in the neighborhoods and there's I think 5 restaurants being permitted within 5 blocks right now, and 2 new retail. Like, I just see it and I see people out, and it's like, well, what is the right narrative? And I think the data is just, I don't know. And we need to have more data.
Yeah. Because it's so messy.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm not kidding. In Chicago, when I was writing about the population loss, and it was like, well, Nashville's growing 82 people a day and Chicago's only growing 82 people in a year. And I mean, at one point, the Predators and the Blackhawks, the hockey teams were playing each other, and they cited my articles as why Nashville was like going to win the hockey game. I mean, it was just like, it was just like ridiculous, like this narrative.
That's a really ridiculous reason to lose a game.
I know. So I think we have to see what happens in the next few years.
I also want more specific data to cities. I feel like, anonymized data, and not, and I love Emily Badger and the work that she does, don't get me wrong, but I feel like we need to kind of look deeper into some of these trends and stuff and see if like what we're actually saying the last 3 years or so about, because people have been saying all kinds of stuff. It's the end of cities. It's the beginning of cities. It's the middle or whatever it is. And I feel like there are issues, obviously, because we can tell by the money that's not being, collected by transit agencies, for example, is a big thing. And so that's a real stat that you can actually count on. But there's other things like moving and stuff it's really choppy and weird in that.
Yeah. And I mean, we know that there's commercial properties values downtown are definitely changing. We know that there's retail that is leaving. We see that. But like when I was studying the Chicago data a couple years ago, we saw this perfect migration from the south side of Chicago to the suburbs of Atlanta, and then to like the suburbs of Indiana, just outside of Chicago. So we could tell that like the types of people that were moving, and then figured out, well, why are they moving? And, segregation and all these other issues that were plaguing the city, causing that population loss. So I think, I think we need to see I think one of the comments in the article was really about opportunities. And that's where if people feel that they don't have the opportunity to live in a place like coastal cities with all these amenities, with transit, those are places that we want people to move to because they don't have to drive and park, it's better for the climate. But it was Abigail Wozniak said the issue is about choice and who has the choices. So like if you're a teacher like I once was, and you think, well, San Francisco, I would love to live there and have all that it has to offer, but it's just like way out of my price range. Yeah. And you just feel that, then, that's where it is like really disturbing, because people feel like they don't have choices.
Right. And that's the thing too, is stuff's super expensive from a housing perspective, but then everything else adds up too. And most people are talking about in when they're talking about housing, it was in the article too, I think getting a washer and dryer or just having extra room for like a playroom or whatever it was, just like having the choice to do that instead, and feeling like that they could get 90% of what coastal cities offer in the other cities, Nashville's or whatever. That's a real feeling that people have, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do.
All right, well, let's continue to talk about this weird sorting that's going on. Let's randomize America. Dalton Conley suggests in a thought experiment that we should think how we can randomly reshuffle America to make everything far more equitable. The idea is that we've already sorted ourselves by neighborhood and politics and income, but that we should rethink ways our social contract is based on place. One way could be a randomized system of tax pods that allow us to pay into a system that distributes value across the country. This was by Dalton Conley in The New Yorker. Another of my eclectic articles that I randomly find when I'm searching for the news every week. Yeah, this one was really fascinating to me because he admits openly that there's no way that this is actually ever going to happen. But I like the thought experiment because I feel like at least it's a stab at kind of what ails us in terms of everybody's picks their cities, they move to these cities. And even if you think about like there's winners and losers when it comes to, say, places like Lansing, Michigan, or Nashville, Tennessee, right? So you have this kind of dichotomy that way too, where people are sorting, they're picking their places and they're going there, and then they're paying into that system, whatever system that is. But then it leaves a whole swath of the country, maybe underfunded or under-resourced. And there might be a way that we can tax ourselves to replace the way that we tax ourselves currently that distributes that value everywhere.
Yeah, and we do this in sense of federal income tax or state income taxes. I mean, it's happening, but like I started thinking about why we couldn't do this. And I think the thought experiment is interesting. And, having worked on tax policy for a long time and trying to fix education funding in progressive places that still wouldn't do these types of things, the people you think would be into thinking about how do we redistribute revenues based on need. And we couldn't get it passed, or like how we're just stuck with Prop 13, which makes school funding and, local goods or local public services, have to rely on Salesforce to donate tens of millions of dollars a year. It's like so ridiculous. But, I was thinking about, well, we've done the New Deal, the Great Society, all the GI Bill, like all these big federal programs that sort of get to this idea. And could we do that now? Because the people that benefit from those programs are people that, like baby boomers, that refuse to change Prop 13. They don't necessarily want to help the next generation through their taxation and I know the thought experiment is that, well, everyone's still paying the same amount. We're just in our pods and redistributing it, on a place base, but we do need more money in some location. Like we know that low income kids need more resources in their, for schools and things like that. So, how do we, I think it's just so hard people are selfish when it comes to their taxes and, don't necessarily want to have these programs like we've enacted in the past for future generations.
I think one of the things that I think he's getting at also is the equal representation and not kind of the cap on the House of Representatives that happened in the early 20th century, I should say. And so, every person in who is represented by somebody in Congress is represented by, basically another 500,000 or whatever amount of people. It's a huge amount of people. And then he's talking about these pods that would allow, for a representation of more like, 100,000 people or less. And so you have actually, 3,300 people that go to Congress instead of 435. And so I think that that's another thing too, is you can kind of expand that number of people that allows maybe a little bit more representation at the individual level and voting for people that you think will. In this case, I think it was like he wanted to randomize the representation too. I don't know about that, but just kind of that representation piece where people feel closer to government, people feel closer to their representative, and they feel like they're being heard and those types of things. And I think that's an interesting point too, from this that came out of this. And he's talking about it in this weird kind of esoteric thought experiment. But I think that there's actually some pieces of it where there's actually some real good thinking behind. Where we could get to if we were actually had not 435 representatives, but actually, more than that actually represented our interests from a place-based perspective. Because if you have, people, right now we're worried about gerrymandering and all that stuff, but if it gets so large that gerrymandering doesn't really matter as much, then you might actually change some, thinking about how things get distributed. And you might actually be able to have a Great Society plan or a New Deal. And actually, I was thinking about that from the article. I was like, oh, well, that's interesting because, if Congress kept increasing in size over time, then that New Deal period right after they closed off the congressional size increases was like perfectly representative in the small amount of people that actually, were represented. And so that made a lot of sense that they would want to do a New Deal type of thing because they had access to the representatives. Whereas as you got larger and larger and larger, it got more disconnected. And so you have, when you get to the 80s and 90s, you have this kind of, pushback against those programs where, it's a different time period. You're represented by less people. And so I found that actually interesting too, when I was thinking through the article.
I don't know how it would work if we had that many people in Congress, like with nothing. There's just too many. But there is something like when you talk about participatory budgeting and, just when people start to feel like government cares about them and they have a part in the process. And, that's what we strive for. And it's just so far removed from people's everyday lives. I mean, how many people just think, well, DC doesn't do anything for me. They just fight. I mean, right now the debt ceiling, and it's just ridiculous because of all the gerrymandering. And I think about like how there's two things here. One is how do we spend the dollars we have, and do we pass this like budget dollars or like these big bills like infrastructure bill, and do we really look at it and say, how does that affect people in their neighborhoods or like in my neighborhood? And when you're representing less people, you can really, get more input and better input and really think about it from a place-based. Like we're spending all this money on electrification and electric vehicles. Well, what if, I mean, it's great, they've gas, but that's not really going to help communities. And if there were representatives that were really thinking about their community and like how many cars do we want driving around, or what's a better investment than spending $1 billion on chargers and that are only might in a few years be the next charging technology will come along and what we built was obsolete. We're talking about transit so much, like just how do we make better investments? And when you have representation that's closer to you from at least from a federal level, you can have those discussions. But right now it's just like, there's lobbying, there's, we got to care about the car industry. We have to do all these other things. And, it doesn't really trickle down to the person that's going to need it.
Yeah. Who are they listening to when those discussions come up, and who are they afraid of making mad?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Shall we go to the next one?
Let's do it.
Death of a building type. On June 24th, 2021, as the pandemic was raging on, a condo building collapsed just north of Miami. A full investigation of the collapse won't be available until 2024, but Richard Bidet knows from his days on a condo board that it was likely neglected by owners and board members that didn't want to spend the money. It's likely 2/3 of condos in the United States are underfunded for fixes, but Bidet argues that it might be time to say goodbye to the creation of condos for good. Richard Bidet in Common Edge. I've always wondered about those big condo buildings and whether people were actually taking care of them. And now I realize that they're not. And their useful lifespans are coming to an end in the next decade or two.
Yeah. A big part of my company just does like building envelope and structural. And it's just huge. It's a huge industry because so many of these buildings are at their useful life. But I was thinking about, so when we first bought a condo in Chicago, we bought a condo in it was a loft in this old pencil factory where they created the number 2 pencil. It was like,
nice.
This super cool place. But I mean, now it has to be almost 150 years old. We like scrapped together the money to buy the place. And then we did get a special assessment like pretty soon after we moved in for the roof. And it was just a lot. I remember thinking like, whoa, we had to pay a lot of money for this. But at least my condo board, I know there was an architect on it. I know there were people on the condo board that understood maintenance and we had reserves and things like that, and people willing to pay the assessments. And I like for condo boards, you don't necessarily have to have any credentials, and it's hard to say, oh, I'm going to tax, people in the seaside condo, 1-bedroom apartments were taxed at 80, or their assessments were like $80,000 for the structural repairs. I mean, you can understand why it's so difficult to make those decisions after all this deferred maintenance, and the outcomes are just catastrophic.
It's crazy. I mean, it's crazy that after a certain amount of time, you're basically going to have to pay for a new building. And so, it might actually be worth it for all the people in that condo to just knock down the building and build a new one almost because of the costs that accrue over time. And this specific one, some of the research that they'd been doing about what happened, the pool was leaking. And so some of the cracks had been coming, and they were actually a week away from starting construction on the retrofit before it fell down. And it's crazy. Now I look at, when you looked at Redfin or whatever, when you're going through and looking for houses, you see all these condo fees or these, the homeowners association fees for like the two buildings. And you're like, oh man, that $450 seems really expensive. Or that I've seen ones around here for like, there's like $150 a month or $300 a month. And now I look back at it after reading this article, I'm like, maybe that $150 wasn't enough, and that's never going to be enough.
Yeah, because that's probably only paying for the operations. That's probably not paying for the capital or the reserve fund.
No, it's probably just for maybe a coat of paint every 10 years or something, right? And so, all of these things have expenses, and it's not just the capital outlay that you start out, and which is scary, like you said, when you scrape for, a down payment plus, take out a mortgage on a condo building, on a condo in a building, and then you have to pay all these other fees. It starts to add up over time. And I was actually thinking, why would anybody ever want to buy a condo now? I mean, after thinking about this building and what happened and the amount of kind of wrangling you have to go through maintenance and stuff, is it even a viable option, over time? Or is it just, we're just going to let people, live there until they collapse?
Well, that's why there's so many, real estate investors that are buying up condos to turn them into apartments, because people are looking at, we built all these condos. I mean, a lot of them haven't retained value. The condo I bought in Chicago, so this was, I don't know, 15, 20 years. I think it's valued at like the same price we paid. Mm-hmm. It hasn't really appreciated because there's so much condo inventory in places like Chicago. So Chicago is that's a city. Florida, Arizona, Texas, there's a big condo deconversion market there where, developers go in and buy the condo building in bulk. Usually you have to have like 75 or 80% of owners agree to sell, but the developers typically will pay above the market value, because then they can rent them out and get higher, they can make the repairs, get higher rents. Given the cost of construction right now, it's cheaper for them to just buy an existing building and turn it into rental, which again, will command higher rates. So that's where we're seeing all these condo deconversions. And I mean, if I were young and then you're stuck in a condo building, I wouldn't mind it. I mean, if I were older and I had remodeled or, I want to stay in my condo, then you're out of luck, especially with a more expensive housing market.
Do those conversion folks, do they go in and make a lot of, do you think they make a lot of structural repairs after they buy it? Because if they buy it over purchase price or over the value and then they have to spend a bunch more, does that pencil? Well,
I think they probably have to make the structural repairs, but they have to get it ready for the rental market. So if they want to sell, rent it on the high end, they have to do the upgrades. But I think if you compare what you get for selling condos versus just renting the apartments, if you're a developer, you get so much more income if you just rent out the apartment. So it probably pencils out. That's why developers are buying out condos all over the country.
Yeah.
So there has to be a lot of value there.
There's a quote in here. There comes a point in every building typology's life when it's time to say goodbye.
I know. Well, it also got me thinking. I just did a study for Santa Rosa last year, and their problem is they have all these parking garages that have a ton of deferred maintenance, and it's tens of millions of dollars to restore them, because again, they're all at the end of their useful life. And the question is, well, how much parking do they need? Should they just sell them off to developers and build housing there?
Yes.
So it's not just, it's all of our infrastructure. We know, it's looking at all of it and saying, well, what's the highest and best use here? I mean, is it to spend $10 million to replace a garage?
Yeah. Well, that's because we saw the garage in New York that fell down. And then actually it was funny, not funny, obviously, but it was interesting. A couple of weeks before, or maybe the week before, I posted an article from a British association saying that car parks are, not structurally sound, and the weight of electric vehicles because of the battery packs and everything is going to make them, collapse and all this stuff. And then a week later, basically, that New York garage collapsed. And I was like, whoa, that's pretty close together. That's kind of crazy. But yeah,
that's a big issue, because we don't design parking. We haven't designed parking for electric vehicles. We designed it for non-electric vehicles. So
especially these buildings from the 20s and 30s where they were just starting out putting cars in there, and they've been around forever. And the cars are obviously much lighter back then than they are now with the SUVs and the heavy, like eventually what we'll get to with the heavy electric vehicles. So it's
and all the electric vehicles, like the Chevy is no longer making the Bulls because they're just want to make, trucks and SUVs. I mean, it's not like these electric vehicles are small and efficient. So
we talked about this with James on the last Monday show, and what happens, what I think I forgot to mention last time is these K trucks for Japan. Basically Japan will tax by weight and by the engine displacement, right? And so it makes sense that if you're thinking about infrastructure from that perspective, there's probably a good reason to actually tax vehicles by weight and size. And especially from a safety perspective, the trucks can't be imported for 25 years. There's a law that says that, basically you have to wait 25 years. And then in 25 years, it's basically a collector's item. And so you can actually import more vehicles then. So there's actually a list every year of all the vehicles that can be imported that year because they can't be manufactured in the US and they have this other thing. But even today, there's or last week, there's an article about Deion Sanders buying this F650 or whatever truck that's like 28,000 pounds.
Was that after factory?
Well, it's actually a commercial. So I read a little bit more on it because I saw a lot of like commentary.
I saw the photos.
It's actually a commercial truck that he just basically had customized for himself so that he could drive it around as his own truck. But usually people use it for like hauling other cars, or like they buy it for their towing company or whatever. It's like it's not necessarily for a personal vehicle. It's actually a commercial truck. But he bought it and had it outfitted. But it still makes sense that if it's 14 tons, you should still pay a tax on that weight, because that's insane. That's super damaging to roads. And imagine if he parked in a garage with that stupid
thing.
He
wouldn't be. Well, yeah, he couldn't.
There's a curb weight, obviously, but
but that's what we're here with a few cities that we are looking at that. How, at least on the commercial side, and charging for commercial vehicle permits to park in commercial spaces. How do we charge based on emissions and exhaust, size of vehicle, and weight of vehicles? I mean, it's still like deliberating like how to pass it, but it is at some point, especially if they're all electric vehicles. I mean, we have to just go to vehicle miles taxed or based on something. Yeah.
There was also another piece saying that, I think it was in Eltis, and then Streets Blog picked it up, basically saying there's a borough in Montreal that's charging for parking by vehicle size, and I think that's a really good idea. And especially as as things get heavier and heavier and heavier for the same size vehicle, and also you see all these pictures of what like a Volkswagen looked like in like the 70s and 80s versus what they look like now, or a BMW or whatever it was. There's pictures all over the internet, you can find them. But the cars have gotten so huge you can't even fit into parking spots anymore, and they can't even get in onto the 10-foot lanes because they're going to start smacking into each other sideways. So there needs to be an end to the kind of the continuous up.
I don't see that there's going to be an end unless there's some mandate. I don't really see that. And that's what we've also have been digging into as cities is, how do you charge? Like, you can no longer think of a parking space as 22 feet, because a truck can't fit in that. A lot of these cars no longer can fit in a 22-foot parking space. So do we just eliminate spaces and think in terms of how many feet do you have? What can you do with it? How do you charge it? How do you charge per foot? Or, I think those are the questions we need to figure out, because it's not fair.
Do you put like a ruler on so you put like a bank of parking meter, right? And then you have a ruler, and then the person has to go to the meter and say, there's like a little laser at each of the ruler points. And they're like, okay, well, I take up this much space on the side. Why don't we pay like 5 quarters instead of 4 quarters? That like the littler car, the smaller.
Well, it could just be attached to your license plate.
I'm trying to think of like really high tech stuff here that
Jeff,
people.
We don't even enforce our current part. Like, We're not getting laser beamed parking meter. Although parking meters do have sensors and all that stuff. Laser beams are probably I'm sure it's in development right now.
Even if it's
Reach
just
out to me.
if it's just a counting tube, even if it's just a counting tube. All right. Well, moving on to other ways to charge drivers. Congestion pricing moves forward in New York City. Federal Highway Administration has signaled that it will allow New York City to move forward with a congestion pricing scheme by approving the environmental assessment of the project. A draft finding of no significant impact FONSI will be up for review for a month. While the MTA hasn't decided on prices yet, they're considering charging passenger vehicles $9 to $23 and $12 to $82 for trucks to enter the central Manhattan zone. Implementation is not likely to happen for another year, as MTA officials will need to set up tolling infrastructure in Manhattan. And this was in Politico by Danielle Dunn. Congestion pricing is coming to New York City. Are you excited?
Wow. Yeah.
Can you believe it?
No, honestly, no, I can't. Because to me, this is such a huge precedent for what maybe we can start taxing our existing roads and highways that receive federal dollars. I worked on 2 transportation reauthorizations and wrote the legislation to toll existing capacities, and it was sponsored by a Democrat. We had like tons of bipartisan support, but we could not get it in back then, like MAP 21 or FAST or any of the authorizations, because it was just like, we cannot toll. Mm-hmm. And the fact that New York City has all these emissions reduction goals, congestion goals. I mean, if you look at what London has done with their congestion pricing, it's just, this is like a game changer. I mean, this is really, I hope it's successful and sets a precedent. The one thing, London did do, that I don't think they're doing in New York City. So on day 1, when they started the congestion charging in London, they rolled out 300 new buses, new service. They had car parks for 8,500 new cars at transit stations. So I haven't seen anywhere that New York is like increasing service day 1 to give people something. Because I worked on congestion pricing for the Illinois toll road, and we were going to share the tolls with transit. And like the whole idea was we're going to have day 1 BRT for people that couldn't afford to pay the congestion charge. So I haven't seen any of that.
No, that's one thing that's frustrating, is that it feels like they're going to use it to backfill, funding shortages and stuff like that. They should really be expanding the service levels if they're going to do the pricing. But I mean, I'm
not complaining.
What are we going to do? I also saw there was articles in the LA Times saying that we should be next. LA should be next. I'm not sure how you do a cordon in Los Angeles. It's kind of not quite as well defined as the Manhattan Island. And then San Francisco, we talked about it for a long time, but with the work from home and the office buildings downtown being kind of not as full as they were before, I feel like that discussion will not come up at any time to pay. We're already having we talked about this a little bit before, but we're already having this weird discussion about Sunday parking meters, which we should totally have. But the politics as it is frustrating.
Well, and there are the bridge tolls. Like we're going to toll 37 soon. Mm-hmm. So I mean, at least we are charging. But in terms of congestion pricing, I think there's this, like, I know New Jersey is, they're mad. They're mad. They want to sue. But when you think about who are the people driving to Manhattan from New Jersey? If you're already driving to Manhattan from New Jersey, MTA said that it's only 3% of commuters are in their cars by themselves driving. I think I counted, you're already paying $1,500 a month right now to drive to Manhattan from the bridge tolls, tunnel tolls, or, to park. I mean, I just don't think paying whatever, we don't know what the rates are going to be, but I don't think the people coming from New Jersey that can already afford to pay $1,500 a month to park in Manhattan will care.
There's actually, so today Streetsblog released an article saying that in the environmental assessment, there's only 5,200 New York residents that drive to central Manhattan that actually live in a transit desert that is not close to frequent transit. So there's only 5,200 people that are like basically
in all of New York, or just Manhattan?
In the city of New York, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was in the environmental assessment. So that's not counting New Jersey, obviously, but people that don't live near frequent transit in New York, that's the number of people that might be impacted by, because there's a lot of, elected officials and others who are complaining, obviously, about, tolls and the congestion pricing. And basically this number that came out of the environmental assessment makes me think, you really don't have much to. That's not a lot of people, and that's not a lot of people that are being impacted.
Less
and actually,
people living in my neighborhood.
But also, like, and yeah, how many people are also going to Manhattan? Like, you're not. A lot of people aren't going to drive single occupancy vehicle into Manhattan. And if you usually go, you take the subway or other means, bike or bus, walking even over the bridge. But like, it seems ridiculous that they haven't done it already.
Yes.
From all that we know about its success in other cities and in Stockholm and in London and other places, Singapore, it just seems like a no-brainer that they should do it in Manhattan. I mean, especially if you see the traffic.
20 years. It's like and then the other thing that came out of the environmental assessment is, I think transit ridership from New Jersey, it's not really going to have many impacts to increase. It said this might only increase transit ridership for people coming from New Jersey to Manhattan by like 1 to 2%, because so many people are already riding transit. There's like no room to grow. So yeah.
So who are the people that the politicians are complaining about, basically, like themselves?
Yeah. Well, I guess like there are businesses that have to deliver from New Jersey or,
sure, but if you're delivering something that big, are you delivering a pipe?
You're like,
pass it on, basically, to the. Yeah. It's going to be more expensive, cost of living.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty. I think this is fundamental change. Like, this is exciting.
Yeah.
So
it is really exciting. It is.
Bravo,
really exciting.
New York City.
Good job. Good job. Well, let's see what happens in a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
Cross my fingers. So. Cross my fingers. Austin's rail line is proving to me that. Bad stuff can happen. So we'll get there in a future show, I'm sure. Well, let's go to Barcelona, shall we? Lessons from Barcelona's radical governance. After the Great Recession, housing and other advocates began organizing a new way to govern outside of political parties and were wildly popular as people wanted change. Now, 8 years later, after a lot of positive reforms, the groups are the incumbents and have to figure out how to continue progressive reforms and long-lasting change while other forces chip away at their support. This was by Mark Engler and Paul Engler in Waging Nonviolence. I've never heard of this magazine before, but I found it randomly, as I do. Like I said, all this random stuff comes up, but it's really fast. I mean, I was like not expecting much from this article when I pulled it up on my tab, and then I started reading it. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. So good job, Engler brothers, I imagine. Yeah, so I threw in this article about Barcelona because I've been kind of super interested to learn about some of their political machinations, especially with all the really impressive things that they've done. And we actually chatted with Michael Newman a little bit about this on episode 392 of Talking Headways, and talking about his book. But I just thought that it was a really interesting look at kind of how the progressive, and it's after the super blocks were started, so it's not like this created the super blocks, but it allowed them to do a lot of really big changes, from taxation of Airbnbs and illegal lodging, which Barcelona is always complaining about because of the tourism. They created their own utility. They've done a lot of reforms around reducing auto driving in downtown Barcelona, in the center city. And so there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the 8 years that they've been there. And I just thought it was really interesting to look at maybe how that politically they did it.
Well, one of the best points I thought that I read in this article was how change takes time. Mm-hmm. And, just this, 4 years just was not enough to do all the things they wanted to do. They said, we realized we needed 8 years to just start, cracking away at, because Barcelona, when you go to Barcelona, it's like, oh my gosh, why can't every city be like this? And, or you just look at it from an aerial and right away, oh, that's Barcelona. I mean, yeah. It's beautiful. But just to institutionalize that change takes time. And the progressive government, when they won majority, they had only 11 of the 41 seats. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they had this super majority where they could just go in, busting walls and taking names. Like, they had to form coalitions and think about, how do you compromise with, and I think that's like so important to remember, is like keeping people engaged is really hard, especially when you have to compromise and build these coalitions and over time. So it just reminds me a lot about everyone that's like so excited to get into politics, or and then you realize, oh gosh, this takes forever. But once you institutionalize it, you can make the change.
Well, also if you're advocates and then you get actually and you actually win, right? Like you are advocates for so long, and this one way to advocate, and then you win. Like when Michael Bloomberg won, and then installed Jeanette Sadik Khan, the advocates became internalized, and so it was like, whoa, what are we doing here, and how do we make change? And so I think that this is a really good example of that. And also they point to, obviously they had good ideas, but then they also had a strong leader in Ada Colau, which is really important too. I mean, I think strong mayors really do make a big difference.
Yes.
And if they have the ability to, kind of, gain respect of their constituents, that's just such a huge part of it. And apparently she's been just kind of a rock in all this.
Oh, I mean, that's what's wrong with San Francisco, is like we don't have a strong mayor government. So, you could have like London Break can say all the things like today she wants to densify commercial districts, but
you have to have the supervisors.
Yeah. But I think the one thing they talked about is the inside outside strategy, where you have the people in government that are working towards this, and then you have the outside organizations that provide the backup. Like when I worked at Metropolitan Planning Council, when the mayor Manuel, which but I will say, like, he put so many of us on his transition team. He brought in a great new DOT commissioner, Gabe Klein, like all the things on transportation were like, oh my gosh, for once we're here, like we can make these changes. And that was really important to provide that outside push where city government and like city planners couldn't really do it. And, organizations like Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago and Spur and San Francisco and RPA, and they can make those, they can make that push. And that's really important, that inside outside strategy.
Yeah. And they could say stuff too, go a little further and, tack to the center if they need to. They can propose something wild and crazy, and then somebody says, oh, cool, why don't we do this half a wild, crazy thing? And we're like, okay, I'm happy with that.
Well, that's what we did. We would and you have like a strong board to back you up, and then the city listens to your board. Yeah. I mean, that's how things can get done.
Yeah. I highly recommend going to check this out. We'll have it in the show notes as we usually do. But the 3 lessons that came out of it were you can show what you did in 8 years, like you said. Changing the culture of institutional politics is really hard. And third, you still need movements on the outside. So kind of those are 3 lessons from this Barcelona, story of them kind of going in and making changes and being really successful at it. Okay, last one. Amazon warehouses are straining Brooklyn. Amazon has opened 2 warehouses in Red Hook, New York, and is planning to open another. Data collected by sensors have been analyzed by journalists at The Guardian and Consumer Reports, found spikes in truck traffic and reduced air quality and increased particulates in the neighborhood. The information could be used to make changes in how e-commerce facilities are regulated across the state. This was by Kevin Waddle, Kava Waddle, Andy Bergman, Aliyah Utiova, and Andrew Witherspoon in both Consumer Reports and The Guardian. So a researched piece where they basically have put up sensors in the neighborhood and started tracking how many trucks are there, what's the air quality, what are some of the impacts in terms of asthma. Really powerful piece. And also I found out about it because my friend Tara Pham, who runs Numina, which is a sensor company, basically their sensors were used to do all the data collection, which was interesting. So I was wondering what you thought about this, because I feel like this is kind of up your alley to a certain extent.
I mean, yeah. So one is Red Hook. When I lived in New York, I used to always take there's this IKEA ferry you could take over to Red Hook. So it's like fun. You take the ferry, and then I would go to those like, this barbecue restaurant I always went to. But I always thought it was like this weird place where it's like cool stuff happening, but then this industrial manufacturing aspect too. And when you look at the map in the article, where it's just like all of these new industrial manufacturing, like basically freight logistics companies building, I mean, that to me is like, well, it's the zoning. I mean, they created this mess themselves. And when residents are saying, well, they're counting, there's like on a small residential commercial street, there's like 140 trucks per hour crossing on that street. you don't need a sensor to say this is there's an issue here, and why have we allowed this to happen? And like New York has all these carbon neutrality goals and low emissions goals, and now we're just building all these Amazon warehouses and FedEx warehouses. Like, what do you think is going to happen? And you congregate them in one place.
Yeah,
that's been historically marginalized.
When you put them in one place, yeah. I mean, I think that there's demand for goods movement to a certain extent, and warehousing. But if you're going to put 3, 4, 5 warehouses in one neighborhood, you're going to get a truck traffic like nobody's business. And I don't think that electrification of vehicles is actually going to do too much, because of the weight of the vehicles causes rubber tire particulates as well as brake dust particulates. And so you're going to see continuation, even if it's not, even if it's not carbon emissions from the engines, it's going to be something else that comes up. And the traffic itself, I mean, taking up that amount of space, we were joking earlier about lasers and showing how much, how big vehicles are when they park. But this is a 10 feet of vehicle on the street, less than every minute, in that 140 example, that's I'm trying to do the math, but that's almost like one every 30 seconds, maybe even lower. And so at some point you'd probably be better off with the train than a bunch of trucks, right? I mean, it just seems ridiculous about how much is happening. And then the story about the asthma rates and the neighbors that live there and are having to deal with this, it's just so frustrating. And it's environmental justice, 101, basically.
Like, why talk about gas ovens? Like, this is way worse.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm just finished up a study with Seattle DOT and C40. And the whole goal of the study was to look at like climate curb management and freight. And we were trying to figure out what are the alternatives to having like these gigantic trucks in the middle of Seattle. So we did a lot of interviewing all the freight companies and Amazon, and like part of it is, are they electrifying, and what does that benefit? And I wouldn't like, there's some benefits in like noise reduction, but at this point, electric trucks, they're just as big as regular trucks. And I don't think there's necessarily an environmental benefit. Like, I was presenting the San Luis Obispo Council earlier this year, and one of the council members was like, by the time you make the battery, all the brake exhaust and, particulate matter that's coming from brakes, and you basically have a regular, you have like the same emissions as a regular vehicle. And then you have all the battery issues. So, and plus you have all the safety issues around all these trucks everywhere. So it's not necessarily like electric trucks are going to make the change. And electric trucks, it's like really hard to get them right now anyway, because of the supply chain. A lot of freight and trucking is done by mom and pops. Like, there's Amazon and there's FedEx for sure, but most of the trucks you see on the road, like the logistics are conducted by like small mom and pop freight, trucking companies. Yeah. And like IKEA, they have this huge sustainability platform. But even IKEA, a lot of their deliveries are done, they like have no control over the logistics end. So these companies, these are the mom and pops, like they can't afford to switch over to electric vehicles, and they're not going to until it's like financially better for them. But at the same time, the other part of our study in Seattle is looking at, well, how do we do e-cargo delivery bikes? And think about neighborhood hubs where maybe you can have the trucks bring in the goods in the evening, overnight, when they're not going to be detrimental to the neighborhood. And then you have these smaller hubs all around the city, and then you use e-cargo bikes to, deliver from there. And they're doing that in New York right now. I mean, they have a really good pilot. And in Seattle, that's like, they're implementing it because they have a goal, and the mayor's like really pushing this, is that they have to reduce delivery emissions by 30%. So it was a huge, that's really going to be like one of the number one things to do that.
Yeah. From a global emissions perspective, we actually talked to folks at WRI a couple of weeks ago, or maybe like a month ago, about the low emission zones, delivery zones, right? ZZs. And one of the things I found was really interesting about some of the research that they did was, if you ask a company to do electric trucks in a certain zone, they might not actually get new electric trucks. They're just going to switch their electric trucks from other fleets in the country, and just so it's not really a net negative in terms of, or net zero in terms of trying to get rid of some of those emissions too. So that's another frustrating thing too. But in this specific example, I mean, I just can't believe how much things have changed over time, and our zoning codes that we expect them to do something for us, right? They're failing us spectacularly, and maybe that's why we should have other regulations instead of zoning codes. But in this instance, this is a commercial district that was for warehousing, but warehousing back in the day, like they said in the article, is totally different than warehousing today. You might have stored stuff for a few months, or have trucks go every once in a while to go pick something up, but you're storing something for a long period of time. Whereas now it's like, if it's on demand delivery, on time, on demand delivery, you're going to have trucks coming out every 20 seconds or whatever it is. So, they need to rethink these zoning codes, or at least regulations more generally, maybe even just get rid of the zoning code and think of another way to do things, because it's really, really impactful.
Well, the article even talks about how a local resident had been trying for a decade to create a makerspace in Red Hook for local food and artisans. And this person has spent like $500,000 on lawyers and plans and can't even get this makerspace built. But the zoning code allows these, freight warehouses. But, so we're talking about the negative impacts of its e-commerce, right? Where everyone's buying things online. We all want the free shipping, free returns, packages in a day. I mean, that just means there's giant trucks and warehouses. And basically my life is spent right now studying this and what's driving deliveries. And for Seattle, well, I've been collecting freight activity all across the country. And then it's the same thing. And in Seattle, we collected data across a week in 4 neighborhoods. The two neighborhoods that had all the deliveries nonstop were Capitol Hill and South Lake Union. And the other 2 neighborhoods that we studied were Columbia City, where it's like a big, great, growing business corridor, but it's mostly 1 to 2 story retail surrounded by single family. So the businesses weren't necessarily driving deliveries. And we also looked at the Chinatown International District in Seattle. And though there's a lot of residential density there, people in the neighborhood tend to be lower income than Seattle as a whole and shop locally. It's just more of a cultural phenomenon to shop locally in the district. So in Seattle and in South Lake Union and Capitol Hill, where they've built multifamily, high rises, it's it was 6 a.m. until 10 o'clock at night. And when I left, there was just truck after truck after truck. And I don't know how you stop that when we want the density, but we just have not figured out. I mean, we figured out through something like an e-cargo bike delivery program, sure. But, there has to be some alternative that cities need to, implement now, because there's no room for all these trucks everywhere. And people are not going to stop purchasing things online.
Yeah. Well, that's the crazy trade-off, right? How do you, if you complain about the trucks but are you going to complain about your delivery as well?
I know. I'm oh, don't shop on Amazon. I just think as planners, it's hypocritical. And I don't know. I really try to shop at stores. But of course, sometimes I have to buy things online. I don't know. I
do too. It's just there's a lot of things obviously that you just can't find because the store, the stores have been reduced in the amount of stuff that they carry. So,
or it's they only have things online. But so for Henry's book, I had to wait an extra week to get it at my bookstore. But I was I am not buying this on Amazon. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of stopping e-commerce, because that's just not going to happen. I mean,
but there has to be some sort of solution it can come up with.
Yeah, which I do think the e-cargo bike is a good solution. In London, so congestion pricing. So since London implemented congestion pricing, last time I was in London earlier in this year, there's e-cargo bikes delivering all over the place because they don't pay the fee.
Yeah.
So the combination of fees, upcharging for the curb space, zoning to prevent like all these warehouses in the same location, and then using e-cargo bikes. Because these aren't like bikes either. They're little mini trucks.
Yeah, they're like mini trucks, but pedal power. Yeah.
Yeah. And they've been successful, and there's lots of pilots in Montreal and even in New York where they work.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll see more of them as more places implement congestion pricing and other things.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm presenting on a webinar with the city of Seattle on June 8th at 2 p.m. Pacific about the program. And also we're joined by Pittsburgh and DC. So we're going to just talk all about the program, because they're really trying to do like an e-cargo bike lending library for small businesses, things that will actually make a difference.
Send me a link. I'll put it in the notes, in the show notes too. That'll make it easier. And it'll be on my because I post the show notes too on my website on theoverheadwire.com too after the show. So it'll be there. Awesome. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways wouldn't be here without you, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month, and you can get one of our transportation scarves. Listener questions and comments. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears. Email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. If you want to get in on that. I didn't actually check to see if I had any emails today, but we're pretty much over time. Puppies and Butterflies. This is part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe just didn't fit in other sections. Chrissy, do you have a Puppies and Butterflies for today?
Well, mine is SFMTA, San Francisco, increasing parking meter hours until 10 p.m. From 6 p.m. and having paid parking Sundays, which... It's being voted on tomorrow, I think. I don't know. My next door is blowing up. I've never seen so many comments on a post. But this is a bold move. It's been proposed in the past. I think it was actually implemented, but eliminated during COVID. And it's just so in line. I was looking at a city last week, and we were looking at the parking meter transaction data compared to the curb use data, which we were collecting with videos and lasers, actually.
Lasers to the wind.
Yeah. And we found, first of all, no one was paying because they're only parking for less than a half an hour and they're just chancing it. But also, you can see where most cities stop charging for parking at 6 p.m., it just starts peaking. So you're charging for people. We said, if you're going to bankruptcy court, you have to pay for parking. If you're going to the theater, you don't. So trying to form it as an equity issue. And I'm really hoping it passes, because
I feel like just, you might have mentioned this earlier, but you think parking is supposed to be perfect, I guess is what you're talking about from Henry's book. And I feel like most people have no idea about what it means to have metered parking on commercial streets and why that's important. And I know the people listening to the show do, which is why I don't need to explain it to everybody. But the business owners who work in these shops and they own these stores and things in San Francisco, they've been called out before for trying to stop changes for bike lanes and those types of things, because what they want isn't for parking for their customers, it's parking for themselves or their staff. And so if they say, if the restaurant association, as they are, complains about the parking regulations and saying well, this is going to really do a dent on San Francisco restaurants. No, it's going to do a dent on your staff who, is going to complain to you about parking. It's the loudest voices. And so if you have a restaurant or a place where you're trying to go on a Sunday night, you're never going to be able to find a space because it's all packed with people who live up the hill who decided that they're going to park their car there because they, have free parking for the afternoon or for the day. And so that's the frustrating thing is people don't really understand that these Sunday meters, it's not about, parking to get to a restaurant. It's about all these other things. I think that's the most frustrating thing to me.
Well, that's what my next door, everyone was saying is the residents. The residents won't have anywhere to park when they come home. And San Francisco, 90% of the curb space in San Francisco is parking, and a majority of that is free. Like, if you can't find a parking space in San Francisco for free, I mean, I understand the issues. I understand there's a lot of curb cuts and driveways, and it's hard to fit a space, but the audience knows. We're not changing.
We're preaching to the choir here.
We're preaching to the choir. But I do think it's like finally, I'm excited. I'm excited to see.
Yeah. My Puppies and Butterflies. I'm not going to talk about La Sombrita. We're not going to talk about La Sombrita. But
oh gosh,
I'm not going to do it.
But we said the name. We like the name.
Yeah, the name's good. But I'm sure there will be more. Actually, I imagine that in 2 weeks there will be a top article, because it already was a top article today. For 2 weeks from now, or maybe 3 weeks from now, whenever the next show comes out, I'm sure we'll talk about La Sombrita. Yeah. But I think for me, generally, I think it's getting to be summer, and so the farmers market has strawberries, they have basil, they have summer things, and I think that's probably the most exciting thing for me is that I can put basil in my eggs in the morning now, because I get it at the farmers market. So that's my Puppies and Butterflies.
I actually have all my strawberries from the farmers market sitting here because I need to clean them and cut the tops off. So,
yeah, there you go.
It's like yeah.
A farmer's market, a summer farmer's market strawberry is just, you can't beat it.
Yeah, no,
you can't beat it.
So,
well, Chrissy, where can folks find you if you want to be found?
On Twitter at Mancini Chrissy, and then my website is mycuriouscity.com.
Awesome. You can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. You can find me on Mastodon to The Overhead Wire, sfba.social. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you, Chrissy, for coming on the show. And we'll see you. Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Talking Monday.